Majority opinions. Thurgood Marshall's tenure on the Supreme Court spanned from 1967 to 1991, a period during which he authored or joined hundreds of opinions that shaped the trajectory of American jurisprudence. While many recall his incisive dissents on issues such as the death penalty, criminal procedure, and racial equality, Marshall also penned significant majority opinions that elucidate his interpretive style and underscore his commitment to the Constitution's core promise of equal justice. These majority opinions, though fewer than those of longer-tenured justices like William O. Douglas or John Paul Stevens, remain essential to understanding how Marshall's legal mind worked when guiding the court's voice. In them, we see how he marshaled doctrinal precedent, historical argument, and moral reasoning into rulings that expanded personal privacy, refined prisoner rights, and set parameters on government authority, especially regarding the treatment of vulnerable individuals. This section offers a deep exploration of four key majority opinions authored by Justice Marshall: Stanley v. Georgia, 1969, Bounds v. Smith, 1977, Ford v. Wainwright, 1986, and Johnson v. Mississippi, 1988. Each case touched on a different dimension of constitutional law, yet all reflect Marshall's broader principles. He believed courts must actively ensure that fundamental rights, whether grounded in the First Amendment, the Eighth Amendment, or the Due Process Clauses, are realized in practice, not merely on paper. Moreover, he consistently argued that law must be interpreted so as to protect the vulnerable, a stance informed by his civil rights background. By surveying these four opinions in detail, we gain a clearer picture of how Marshall, speaking for the court, integrated textual analysis, legal precedent, and real-world empathy to shape doctrine that would endure long after his tenure ended. Stanley v. Georgia, 1969, Privacy and the Sanctity of the Home, Factual and Procedural Background. The first major majority opinion Marshall authored on the Supreme Court was Stanley v. Georgia, decided in 1969, just 2 years into his service. The case arose when law enforcement officers, executing a search warrant for alleged bookmaking activities, discovered obscene films in Robert Stanley's home. Although the officers did not find any evidence related to gambling, they seized the films and charged Stanley under a Georgia statute criminalizing the possession of obscene material. Stanley contested the constitutionality of applying the obscenity law to private possession in one's home. He argued that while states might regulate the distribution or public display of obscene materials, punishing an individual for possessing them within the privacy of his residence went beyond the Constitution's tolerance. The case thus forced the court to weigh a state's claimed interest in eradicating obscenity against the strong presumption of privacy within the home. Marshall's majority reasoning. Writing for a unanimous court, Justice Marshall delivered a concise but powerful statement on the scope of individual privacy. He held that the government could not criminalize the mere possession of obscene material by a person within his own home. The opinion drew upon several constitutional strands. First Amendment freedoms. Marshall recognized that while obscenity may not enjoy full First Amendment protection, punishing private possession risked chilling lawful expression. If states could ban possession outright, citizens might fear keeping any materials that some authority might deem obscene, thus curtailing broader freedoms of speech and thought. Privacy and the home. More significantly, Stanley rested heavily on the concept that the home is a sanctuary from governmental intrusion. Marshall grounded this view in earlier precedents, including Griswold v. Connecticut, 1965, which acknowledged a zone of privacy protecting intimate matters. He argued that however offensive certain materials might be, punishing mere possession encroached on the right to be let alone within one's residence. Autonomy of thought. Marshall's opinion also invoked the fundamental idea that freedom of thought is integral to personal liberty. Even if states might restrict the public distribution of obscene materials, controlling what a person reads or watches privately invades the domain of individual autonomy. This aspect of the opinion pointed to a principle that would recur in Marshall's later jurisprudence, that the state's authority wanes significantly at the threshold of the home, where personal autonomy peaks. Significance and aftermath. Stanley versus Georgia became a cornerstone of American privacy jurisprudence, underscoring the home as a protected sphere, though later decisions sometimes distinguished or limited the scope of Stanley, particularly regarding child pornography or other categories of contraband. Stanley's fundamental holding, that mere possession of obscene material in one's home cannot be criminalized, has endured. For Justice Marshall, the case foreshadowed a line of thought he would champion in subsequent decisions: that constitutional rights must have real meaning in everyday contexts, not simply theoretical significance. By leading the court in protecting private possession of controversial materials, Marshall helped lay a foundation for a broader notion of privacy, one that would soon encompass reproductive decisions in Roe v. Wade and other personal matters. Even beyond obscenity law, Stanley influenced arguments about the outer limits of government intrusion into private life, exemplifying Marshall's belief that the Constitution's promise extends into the most intimate facets of human existence. Bounds v. Smith, 1977. Prisoners' access to the courts. Context and dispute. By the 1970s, the Supreme Court had begun grappling with the rights of incarcerated individuals to legal resources. Inmates lacked direct access to attorneys for civil matters or post-conviction petitions, and often relied on prison libraries, if such libraries existed at all, to research their claims. Bounds v. Smith revolved around a class action lawsuit brought by inmates in North Carolina, alleging that the state's prison libraries were inadequate and deprived them of meaningful access to the courts. At issue was whether the Constitution's guarantee of access to the courts, grounded in the First Amendment right to petition and the 14th Amendment's due process principles, required states to provide minimum library facilities or alternative assistance, e.g., legal aid. Several lower courts had reached varied conclusions on whether a right to law books existed, but the Supreme Court had not directly addressed the question. Marshall's majority opinion. Justice Marshall's opinion for the court in Bounds v. Smith marked a pivotal affirmation of prisoner rights. The majority held that states must ensure inmates have a reasonably adequate opportunity to present legal claims, whether through libraries, trained legal personnel, or a combination of these resources. Marshall's reasoning included several critical dimensions: historical and doctrinal foundations. Marshall traced the principle of access to the courts back to cases such as Ex parte Hull, 1941, which struck down prison regulations that curtailed a prisoner's ability to file habeas petitions. He argued that safeguarding the ability to challenge unlawful convictions or conditions of confinement is intrinsic to the legal system's integrity. Meaningful access versus formal gesture. The opinion emphasized that providing a theoretical right to file legal papers is empty unless inmates possess the resources or assistance needed to make that right real. By requiring states to choose among solutions-enhanced library facilities, legal assistance programs, or other mechanisms, Marshall placed the burden on government to ensure that incarcerating a person does not equate to stripping them of fundamental legal recourse. Equality and practical realities. Given Marshall's lifelong advocacy for marginalized populations, Bounds is suffused with the recognition that prisoners are among the most powerless. The opinion observed that illiteracy, poverty, or mental illness often compound the difficulties inmates face. Marshall's insistence that states actively remedy these barriers echoed his broader jurisprudential theme: constitutional promises must be operationalized for those least able to advocate for themselves. Impact and legacy. Bounds temporarily elevated the standard for prison law libraries and legal assistance programs. Many correctional systems responded by upgrading their library collections, hiring legal aids, or contracting with attorneys for inmate counseling, while subsequent cases like Lewis v. Casey, 1996, narrowed some of Bounds's broad language by demanding proof of actual injury to challenge library inadequacies. The fundamental premise that inmates have a right of access to courts endured. For Marshall, Bounds represented the court's recognition that constitutional rights do not vanish behind prison walls. Though the decision did not address all aspects of prison life, It underscored that a basic level of legal support is essential to ensuring justice. In line with his approach elsewhere, Marshall's majority opinion put the Constitution's real-world application at the forefront, refusing to accept token gestures over genuine solutions that might help prisoners vindicate unlawful detentions or cruel conditions. Ford versus Wainwright, 1986. The Eighth Amendment and Executing the Insane. Historical backdrop. The Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishments has been a focal point for controversy, especially regarding the death penalty. Thurgood Marshall's outspoken opposition to capital punishment was well known by the mid-1980s. Often he found himself in dissent, lamenting decisions that upheld the constitutionality of executions. Yet in Ford versus Wainwright, he authored a majority opinion setting a crucial limitation on the state's ability to carry out death sentences against a particularly vulnerable class of defendants, those found insane at the time of execution. Alvin Ford was on Florida's death row for murder when he began displaying significant signs of mental illness. Florida, however, employed an administrative process that allowed the governor to determine Ford's mental status without a full judicial hearing. Ford challenged this procedure, asserting that executing an insane person was not only cruel and unusual, but that the determination of insanity required procedural safeguards. Marshall's opinion for the court. Ford versus Wainwright yielded a majority opinion by Marshall that established two critical points. 1. The Eighth Amendment forbids executing someone who is insane at the time of execution. And 2. States must afford condemned inmates a fair hearing on the question of current mental status. The opinion embodied Marshall's characteristic approach to constitutional interpretation in capital cases. Historical underpinnings. Marshall surveyed common law traditions, showing that the practice of executing the insane had historically been disfavored. English jurists, for instance, recognized that an insane inmate could not comprehend the rationale behind capital punishment. This historical lineage bolstered the argument that, in the American context, executing the insane violated evolving standards of decency, moral and practical rationale. The majority drew on reasons that transcended simple tradition. Executing someone who cannot understand why he is being punished or the nature of the penalty undermines the retributive and deterrent goals of capital punishment. Marshall's stance that punishment's legitimacy depends on the defendant's capacity to grasp its significance illustrated his broader moral perspective, that the Constitution's protections must guard against inhumane or pointless forms of cruelty. Procedural due process. Equally significant, Marshall's opinion required meaningful procedural protections in assessing insanity. He found Florida's system, which placed near unchecked discretion in the governor's hands, to be constitutionally inadequate. Instead, states had to conduct a fair hearing, one that allowed the inmate to present evidence of mental incapacity and receive a neutral adjudication. Subsequent developments and lasting influence. Ford versus Wainwright did not abolish the death penalty as Marshall wished, but it imposed a vital limitation. Later decisions, such as Panetti versus Quarterman, 2007, built upon Ford by clarifying that a prisoner's mere awareness of the fact he is being punished does not suffice if he lacks rational understanding of why. Thus, Marshall's fundamental premise that the Eighth Amendment and due process constraints protect mentally incompetent inmates from execution remains good law. The case exemplified Marshall's capacity to assemble a majority around discrete but consequential restrictions on capital punishment. While he objected to the death penalty in all circumstances, as evidenced by his repeated dissents in capital cases, Ford stands out for harnessing a historically grounded argument to achieve a narrower result more agreeable to a majority coalition. Through this opinion, Marshall advanced both a moral and constitutional standard that resonates in continuing debates about mental health, criminal justice, and the limits of capital punishment. Johnson versus Mississippi, 1988. Reliability in capital sentencing. Case background and issue. By 1988, Thurgood Marshall had spent over 2 decades on the Supreme Court, witnessing the court's capital punishment jurisprudence shift dramatically from Furman versus Georgia, 1972, which briefly halted the death penalty, to Gregg versus Georgia, 1976, which reinstated it. In Johnson versus Mississippi, the court confronted another aspect of death penalty procedure: whether a capital sentence that relied on a subsequently invalidated conviction could stand. Willie Johnson's death sentence in Mississippi was partly predicated on a prior New York conviction used as an aggravating factor. After the Mississippi jury recommended death, Johnson successfully got the New York conviction reversed on appeal. Nonetheless, Mississippi courts refused to reconsider his death sentence, even though the aggravating factor was no longer valid. Johnson argued that relying on a vacated conviction undermined the reliability of the capital sentence, conflicting with the Eighth Amendment's heightened demands for due process in death penalty cases. Marshall's majority opinion: writing for a unanimous court, Justice Marshall vacated Johnson's death sentence. He held that once the prior conviction was nullified, the premise for using it as an aggravating factor vanished, rendering the sentencing process constitutionally infirm. Key points of the opinion included: Eighth Amendment emphasis on reliability. Capital cases require heightened reliability to ensure that only the most culpable offenders receive the ultimate penalty. Marshall explained that allowing a vacated conviction to stand as an aggravating factor contravened this essential principle. If the aggravator was pivotal in a jury's determination, the resulting death sentence might be predicated on erroneous or prejudicial information. Due process and fundamental fairness. The opinion also invoked 14th Amendment due process, stating that fairness forbids states from executing someone on the basis of invalid evidence. Marshall tied the concept of fairness to the broader sense of justice, echoing his long-standing concern that capital sentencing be free of arbitrary or misleading influences. State flexibility versus constitutional mandate. Mississippi attempted to argue that any error was harmless or that the state had independent reasons for imposing death. Marshall, however, emphasized that courts must demand strict adherence to constitutional norms when an individual's life is at stake. The decision left open the possibility that Mississippi could resentence Johnson without the invalidated conviction, though it had to do so under proper procedures. Legacy and reflections. Johnson versus Mississippi did not spark widespread changes in capital punishment law, but it reaffirmed a bedrock principle: sentencing must be reliable, free from reliance on void or unreliable evidence. In a broader context, the case complemented Marshall's consistent critique of capital punishment's susceptibility to error and unfairness. By forging a unanimous opinion, he demonstrated that at least for the narrower question of vacated convictions, the entire court agreed that reliability was paramount. The ruling also signaled Marshall's commitment to ensuring procedural rectitude in sentencing, particularly in death penalty cases, where the stakes are highest. Though it did not adopt Marshall's more radical stance that the death penalty itself is unconstitutional, Johnson advanced a principle near to his heart: that the Eighth Amendment imposes strict evidentiary and procedural constraints, and any flaw undermining a death sentence's fairness cannot be brushed aside. Common threads and broader reflections on Marshall's majority opinions. While each majority opinion recounted here tackles distinct constitutional questions: private possession of obscene materials, inmate access to courts, the execution of the mentally incompetent, and the reliability of aggravating factors in capital cases, they share deeper thematic resonances that illuminate Marshall's judicial philosophy. Empathy for the marginalized. Whether addressing prisoners with limited resources, individuals with mental illness facing capital punishment, or even private citizens whose reading choices might offend community norms, Marshall consistently stood for those in weaker positions relative to the state. His majority opinions exhibit a willingness to examine how laws or procedures play out in real life, rather than assuming that formal rules alone guarantee justice. Concrete implementation of rights. Across his opinions, Marshall underscored that a declared right is only as strong as the mechanisms enforcing it. In bounds, the right of access to courts demanded tangible support. Libraries, legal help. In forward, procedural due process must accompany the Eighth Amendment bar on executing the insane. In Stanley, privacy meant the state could not intrude upon one's home to regulate personal readings. Repeatedly, Marshall sought to ensure that lofty constitutional ideals manifested in practical legal protections, historical context, and evolving standards. Marshall often rooted his arguments in historical common law practices, as in Ford, or drew upon the Warren Court expansions in prisoners' rights, as in Bounds. Yet he also championed a living constitution approach, emphasizing that the Eighth Amendment's evolving standards of decency shape how laws should be applied in the modern era. For Marshall, the Constitution's text and history provided a baseline, but contemporary moral and social understandings were crucial to applying timeless principles to present challenges. Coalition building. Although known for powerful dissents, Marshall's majority opinions highlight his ability to craft narrower holdings that other justices could accept. In Ford and Johnson, for instance, he bridged divides by focusing on widely recognized constitutional imperatives, fairness, reliability, and historical aversion to inhumane practices. By doing so, he secured unanimous or near unanimous support, thereby reinforcing the stable precedential footing of those decisions. Limitations and subsequent narrowing. As with many Supreme Court decisions, some of Marshall's majority opinions did not remain unscathed by later rulings. Bounds, for instance, was restricted by Lewis versus Casey in 1996. Stanley faced nuances related to child pornography or public obscenity laws. Still, the core holdings of these cases remain intact, a testament to Marshall's skill in anchoring them in robust constitutional reasoning that could withstand shifting court majorities. Conclusion: Marshall's majority opinions and their ongoing significance. Thurgood Marshall's majority opinions form a critical, yet sometimes overlooked portion of his legacy. He will forever be remembered for iconic dissents on issues like the death penalty dissents that remain guiding lights for contemporary reformers. However, the opinions he wrote for the court also reveal a justice adept at winning colleagues' agreement around foundational constitutional principles. Through Stanley versus Georgia, he established an enduring bulwark of privacy within the home. In Bounds versus Smith, he championed a real, tangible right of access to the courts for inmates, warning against the hollowness of purely theoretical guarantees. With Ford versus Wainwright, he carved out a crucial Eighth Amendment limit on executing individuals unable to understand their punishment. And in Johnson versus Mississippi, he underscored the necessity of reliability and fairness in capital sentencing. Taken together, these opinions confirm Marshall's reputation as a justice profoundly committed to human dignity, skeptical of government overreach, and determined that constitutional freedoms not be relegated to abstractions. Each also highlights a dimension of his broader jurisprudence. That law must engage with lived realities, ensuring that marginalized and vulnerable people, be they prisoners, impoverished defendants, or private citizens facing intrusive moral legislation, remain protected under the Constitution. In the decades since Marshall's retirement, subsequent courts have sometimes constrained, sometimes upheld, or sometimes extended the frameworks he established. Yet his majority opinions endure as foundational texts, integral to any comprehensive study of the Supreme Court's modern evolution. They blend historical grounding, moral clarity, and practical insight, reflecting a justice whose life's work was bridging the gap between constitutional ideals and social justice on the ground. And even when subsequent rulings narrow or complicate these cases, the heart of Marshall's arguments, his insistence on a constitution that genuinely shields personal liberty and equality, continues to resonate with jurists, scholars, and advocates who see in his words a potent vision for an America that honors the dignity of all its people. About the author, Johann Drolshagen is a seasoned technology expert with deep expertise in cloud architecture, software engineering, system administration, DevOps practices, and content management systems. His professional experience spans diverse roles, including technical leadership, strategic consulting, and innovative digital solutions development. In addition to his technical pursuits, Drolshagen is an accomplished author and researcher, specializing in the intersection of technology, law, and governance. His extensive body of work includes books, scholarly articles, and policy analyses, exploring how emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, data privacy, and blockchain interact with legislative frameworks and public policy. Through his writings, Droelshagen seeks to bridge the divide between technological innovation and legal governance, creating valuable resources for policymakers, legal professionals, technologists, and academics. His multidisciplinary approach supports the development of informed, adaptable legal systems capable of responding effectively to rapid technological evolution, thereby fostering equitable and sustainable policies in an increasingly digitized global society.